mist had risen high, and the stars were gone. I could see within the garden well enough, but not far. The chapel walls were lost. Found. The mist was retreating. It was not natural, for it moved in a slow spiral as though we were in the vortex of a vast grey whirlpool. Strahd. She drew my attention back to her, pulling me down for another kiss. I ran my hands through her thick russet hair, stripping away the virgin's veil of her gown. Tonight, I would be her husband and she my wife. Tonight would be the first of thousands yet to come. Tonight, I would teach her more about love than she had ever dreamed. No woman before her or since would know of better. My lips brushed over hers, then moved onto the hot silk of her throat. She sighed at the touch, her breath coming sharply with that first awakening of true pleasure. "My Lord Strahd," someone called from the gate. "No, not now. Not now." Her body melded into mine, and she threw back her head. I supported her easily. She was so light, like a swan floating over its own reflection. "Lord Strahd, come quickly." Tatra, vainly trying to call me away from all that I'd worked for, given everything for. "Murder, Strahd!" Murdered for. I ignored him. Tatiana's heartbeat was as fast as mine. I felt it rushing through her. "Betrayal!" He was blundering around us in the mist. "Damn him!" I roared in my mind. Tatiana cringed and stiffened in my arms. "Strahd? What the... Hush. I'll send him away." Now she was fighting me. I released her, and she stepped back. Her breath came hard. Her hands went to her throat, where I began to kiss her in earnest. "Elda, we must not do this." I held my hand toward her. "No, it's all right. This is as it was meant to be." "But Sergei..." "He's gone. You will accept it and turn to me." But her face crumpled as the fact of Sergei's death overwhelmed her once more. No! Her grief would have to run its natural course. I saw that now. But I had time. More time than any man ever before me. I could wait. And would. "Strahd!" Several voices now. This time the shouts came from the chapel, along with the cries and screams of women and children and the crash and ring of weapons. What in the name of all the hells was going on? Tatra suddenly staggered out of the swirl of mist. His uniform was torn and bloody. "Betrayal, my lord," he gasped. "Delisnia traitors killing everyone." One of the chapel windows shattered. The screams were louder, more clear now. My hand went to my sword, but Tatra stopped me. "Too late for that, my lord. There's been long planning in this. You must try to escape while you can." I started to snarl a reply, then looked at Tatiana. She had to be kept safe. "Are the stables free?" "I don't know." "We'll find out. Run ahead. If the stables are held, we'll make for the gate." "Yes, lord." He ran off. "Come, Tatiana." I took her hand. "No!" She pulled away. "I'm staying here with Sergei." This was no moment for foolishness. I grabbed her arm and started dragging her from the garden. "No, Elder," she tried to shake away. "I will stay with him."
"For how long? You think they'll let you live?"
"I'm hoping they won't." Now she did wrest from my grip. I lunged to catch her again, but she shied away and ran. I called her name. She seemed not to hear. She darted through the low gate leading to the overlook. "No! Tatiana!" I was right behind her, but she made for the low wall. Up! In one light bound, I clawed and caught only air. Gone. The mist had cleared for most of the mountain, but the valley was still hidden. Tatiana's frail figure dropped, spinning, into that roiling white cloud. Tattered fingers of it stretched toward her, and arms spread wide. She plunged headfirst into their grasp. She shrieked the whole way down. Sergei's name. My name, I couldn't tell. I couldn't hear for my own scream. It was swallowed by the mist below, vanishing, even as she vanished. Silence. Then, laughter. Its laughter, with all their voices. Her voice. I screamed again to drown them out, but it was inside my head as well, and nothing could stop it. I fell away from the wall, fell to my knees. The blackness returned, covering me, never to lift. Ever. I'd not known true despair until now. Von Zarovich, groveling, the voices mocked. No. Just a man like any other. A man who has lost everything. The agony was so great. I did not feel the first arrow when it slammed into my side. Men crowded into the overlook, all in the Delisnia colors, all poised to shoot, and one after another, they did. I braced and took the arrows, welcoming them to age not one more day. Very well, then. Let me die now. On my knees again, the archers cautiously approached. I'd taken enough shots to kill a dozen men, but still lived. Not right. Not natural. No. Laughter for my realization. To age not one day more. I wasn't going to die. Not tonight. Not ever. Laughter for my anguish. 1,000 nights. 1,000 years lay before me. Without her. Alone. Laughter. One of the bastards kicked me. I was nothing to them, only another kill. Perhaps more stubborn than the rest. But that made for better sport. They laughed, their voice unknowingly joining the vile chorus in my head. Oh, laughter for my newborn rage. I was looking at dead men. I could not die, but they would. Before another hour passed, I'd send them wailing on their way to rotting hell. All of them. All, except the traitor behind them. For him, something special. Who? The one who kicked me now passed his bow to another man, then removed his helmet. Leo Delisnia. The walls of the main dining room were splashed and stained with blood. The room still looked prepared for a celebration. The candles on the 3 chandeliers above were all alight. Lying as I was on the cold floor, I had ample opportunity to study their bright beauty. Illusion. Nothing was beautiful anymore. Beauty had died when she... Before carrying me here, rough hands had ripped the arrows from my body. The many wounds burned like coals. They had also stopped bleeding. So far, no one had noticed. One man had been detailed to guard me. More stood ready over the other prisoners. Ivan Buchvold, his brother-in-law, Victor Wachter, and Victor's 9-year-old daughter, Lovina. The girl clung to her father, too stunned to cry. The double doors were thrown open. Accompanied by guards, Lady Ilona and Reinhold Delisnia were shoved in our direction. Ilona kept her feet. Reinhold, his face greyed, dropped down. Ilona went to him and bowed her head in prayer. I turned away, gritting my teeth. Lord Strahd? Ilona knelt next to me. She reached out. "Touch me not," I snarled. She jerked her hand back. "My lord." Then she got a really good look at me. If the changes were visible to anyone, they would be to her. She saw and understood. "Oh, Strahd, what have you done?" She somehow knew I was myself responsible. Everything or nothing. I had never seen her weep before. "My lady needs to control herself," I murmured. I was laughing. Her eyes fixed on my open mouth. I knew what she was looking at. I felt their sharp, new points well enough with my tongue. "Oh, if I could help you, I would," she whispered. As if I cared much now for the soul I'd given up. "Tell me what's going on." She hesitated. Wise of her. In dealing with what I had become, it would always be a good idea to be as cautious as possible. "Where's Leo Delisnia?" More hesitation. Leo may have been the architect of tonight's slaughter, but he was still like her, still human, while I was not. I let my eyes slide over to the other prisoners.
Tell me, and I can help save them.
Yes, that was her weakness. I don't know where Leo is, but he'll be here soon. The guards said as much.
What of my people?
Dead, all poisoned and dying. The guests, all dead. Those loyal to you, anyway. Where's Sergei and Tatiana? I laughed again, because I was no longer able to cry. Ilona shivered and made the protective sign of her faith.
Don't.
She froze. I am sorry for you, Strahd.
Save it for those who need it.
She stared for a very long moment, pity, horror, compassion, and disgust playing over her face. It was of no importance to me. I glanced toward the others. Just keep silent, lady. A nod, a rustle of skirts as she rose, and the harsh pressure of her immediate presence lifted from me. Some of my strength came trickling back, but my throat was so raw. I needed something to drink. The smell of blood positively filled this room. The guard next to me had put some distance between us. Reinhold was closest, but his scent was somehow wrong. Tainted. Leo again. All those years of Reinhold's sickness made perfect sense now. How long had Leo been planning this? How long had he been gradually poisoning his brother? No matter. It would end tonight. The doors swung open again, and Gunther Cusco was pushed through. Down one side of his once handsome face, he'd taken a cut. He'd have a very bad scar if he lived long enough for it to heal. The guards left him alone. He said nothing, and did not meet our eyes. Flanked by some of his men, Leo Delisnia came in. He had draped an ostentatious gold chain of office around his neck. He'd traded his bow for a sword. Our guards came to attention, and Victor and Ivan stood up. He passed them and Gunther by, though, and stalked over to where I lay. "Hail, Strahd, Lord of Barovia," he said softly. "Not for long, by the look of you. Thought you'd be dead by now. What are you waiting for?" Coughing, like a dying man, I murmured, "An explanation." "I'm surprised you haven't got it from Reinhold already." "Oh, yes. He isn't in any condition to do much talking, is he?" He prodded Reinhold with his boot, getting no reaction. "Looks better than he did. Is that your doing, lady?" Ilona said nothing. She sat by the wall, holding Lovina. Ivan Buchwald asked, "Why, Leo? My poor Gertrude did you no harm. Our children. I mean, how could you?" Tears spilled from his eyes. "How could you?" "And my Oleka," Victor added. "And our children, your own sisters, Leo." "Half-sisters," he returned. He prodded Reinhold again. "Half-brother, too, for that matter." "What do you mean?" asked Ilona. Leo cocked an eye at Gunther. "Why don't you tell them? You were so damned eager to tell me." "Don't I wish I hadn't," Gunther replied sullenly. Leo laughed. "You'd think I wouldn't have done this otherwise. Your great revelation about yourself and Mother made no difference to me, old man. I've been working on this for years, since before the end of the war." "Balversi," I whispered. He showed his teeth and came over. "So, you see the truth of it. Took you long enough." Alex's last words made sense now. Even as he lay dying by my hand, he tried to warn me. "Beware the Balversi, the great traitor who will take all for himself." "You should have died the first night we were here," said Leo. "Then Reinhold would have taken up the rule. After a decent interval, he'd have passed on from a bad belly, and I'd have stepped in as was my right. If that bastard Gwillem hadn't turned up at the wrong time, quite a few people here might yet be alive. Where is he?" "I don't know," I answered truthfully. "We'll find him. I certainly took the both of you in with my play-acting then. All I had to do was think of what poor Ilya might have said, and you swallowed it whole. Maybe he'll rest more easily in his grave now that... Oh, excuse me. Assassins are burned, and their ashes scattered. That's what Strahd's men did to the body, didn't they, Ivan?" Ivan was swaying on his feet for 1 second and flying at Leo the next, fingers locked around Leo's neck. Men rushed in and eventually separated them. Ivan was beyond sanity. 6 men were holding him down and having a hard time of it. Not for long. Leo recovered and drew his sword. He stood over Ivan, eyes blazing. Ilona hugged Lovina to her breast so she wouldn't see. Ivan gave out a long scream that ended only for lack of breath. Leo wrested his blade from the body and wiped it clean on Ivan's clothes, rubbing his throat. He signed for the men to take the body out. The scent of fresh blood blossomed into the room, sweeter than any perfume. I hungered. I thirsted. I craved more with a keenness that diminished all previous wants. Nothing else mattered, but that I immediately answered this overwhelming need. Ignoring the pain, I turned over, pushed the floor away, stood. Worried, my guard came around to face me. A man as badly torn as I should be dead. Not standing, not stepping toward him, smiling. He raised his sword to strike. I knocked it away. Victor instantly grabbed it up, dropping into a fighter's crouch. The remaining guards were only just turning to see what was making the commotion. My man froze. I moved in, seized his shoulder, and spun him around. He screamed, but I heard nothing, deafened as I was by the roar of his rushing blood. I took from him all I could take, emptied him until his struggle stopped and his limp weight hung heavily in my arms. Leo's men were stricken motionless, all their eyes on me. They were about to find out the true cost of this job. I lifted the guard's body high and threw it across the room to a knot of men. Some went down and stayed that way. One of the archers notched an arrow, drew, and released. It went deep into my chest. He let fly a second shaft, striking just below the first. He was starting on his third when I reached him, pulled the arrows from my body, and plunged them into his own. He thrashed and went quiet. Leo's men scattered in a wide circle around me. Some made for the doors and temporary escape. Temporary only, hacking wildly at 2 men at once. Victor shouted my name like a war cry. He had a dead wife and children to avenge, and another child to protect. Ilona shouted my name for a different reason. She was behind Victor, trying to drag Lovina out of harm's way. The ones at the back were already through the door. The rest hurried to join them, getting in each other's way in their haste to leave. My laughter followed them out. I turned back to the others. Victor had killed his second man and was hunched over, catching his breath. "Come here, Victor," I said. Sword in hand, but held in a non-threatening manner, he walked across to me. He was afraid, but not giving in to it. He saw me as I was, as Ilona saw me, but I was still his liege, his commander. "I want you to stay here until I return," I told him. He nodded. "Yes, my lord." "Good. Now, bolt the doors behind me." Following the panicked soldiers, I made my way to the front courtyard. 2 men had been posted to defend the entry. They fought me, and they died. Those of their companions who had paused to watch now took to their heels. If any of my own people survived, I did not see them. Only the bodies of those cut down. I did not see Leo among the men, but caught a glimpse of some riders going over the drawbridge at full gallop. If he was among them, it was all right. Sooner or later, I would find him. For now, I had to stop his men. The blood I'd taken gave me more strength than I had ever imagined. The old limitations no longer applied. I bent and scooped up a handful of earth, closing it tightly in my fist. I, Strahd, am the land. Letting the dirt drop, I said a word of power, and the portcullis crashed down and closed off the keep. The men were trapped inside now, with me. Striding over, I waded into them. I still had the sword I'd taken from the guard I killed, and I put it to full use. They fought and screamed and died. Their own blades passed right through me as though I were a wraith. It didn't take much of this to send them running, perhaps hoping to find a hiding place. Like their master, they would find no sanctuary, for I knew every stone, every corner. This was my home. My home, and their graveyard. It turned out Tatra had made it to the stables after all. He and 8 of the men were the only ones left out of my own guard. They were nervously waiting in the courtyard by the time I returned with the other survivors in tow. I took him and Victor to one side. "I formally release you and the others from my service," I said to Tatra. This surprised him. "But my lord," he began. "I ask that you attach yourself to Lord Victor's house to serve him as loyally as you have served me." He glanced at Victor Wachter, who was looking at me with sad understanding. "Very good, Lord Strahd." "You're not coming, are you?" Victor asked. "There's work yet to do. None of you must remain. I want you to ride fast and get as far away as you can. As you value your life and soul, do not ever return to this place." He demanded no explanations. "Yes, my lord." "Tell Lady Alona I said goodbye and that I hope she never sees me again." He nodded. "I now formally release you from my service." He held out his hand to me. I looked at it for a long time and finally shook my head. "No." He seemed to know why I chose not to touch him. "Say nothing of this. Now, get out of here while you still can." He and his new men mounted up and rode toward the gate, the carriage following. A word, a gesture to empower it, and the portcullis raised itself just long enough for them to get through, then slammed down once more, locking me in with the dead and those who were about to die. 6th moon, 3:52. Head down, I held fast to the rock face like some impossible spider and let my eyes roam this section of the mountain once more, hoping to find some trace of her passage. It was a sheer drop from the castle overlook 1,000 feet above, and this would be the spot where her body would have first touched earth. Touched and shattered. I shook that thought from my mind. It had haunted me constantly during my initial searches. I knew what to expect. By this time, she would have gone to bone, perhaps with some tatters of her white silk wedding gown clinging to them. I still needed to find her, though. Enough of that former self remained in me to want to make some memorial to her, for in so doing, I might be able to find some peace for myself. The night after her death had been the beginning of my search, and I'd been down here nearly every night since, going over each stone, peering into each crevice. No trace. Nothing. Perhaps whatever had taken Alec Willem's body from a locked closet had seized her as well. That possibility hovered on the edge of my mind like a wisp of poisonous smoke. I moved sideways now, finding solid holes on the smoothest plains of rock. Yet another power granted to me by my pact with death. Since then, I'd heard no more taunting voices. Most of the time, I ignored the silence, having other cares to occupy me, like my constant need for blood. For the last year, Leo Delisnia's men had fulfilled that need, singly or in terrified groups. I'd captured the lot, taking them down to the cells far below the keep, and successfully kept most of them alive in that time. By trial and error, I learned just how much to take to feed myself, yet not kill. I could have drained each to the dregs and still hungered, but that would have quickly deprived me of a larder. Hence, I made myself break away before it was too late for the subject. Of course, when I was very hungry, this was not easy to judge. As the men grew weak from their blood loss and confinement, they died. Not a few went mad, but I had no pity for them. How cheerfully they had carved into the guests under my protection. My trips to the dungeons to throw them food and drink would often yield up another corpse to be removed, which I did without complaint. When that happened, I carried the body away to my working room. There, by methods set down in detail in my books, I was able to put new life, of a sort, into it. Garbed again in my colours, they took the place of the slaughtered servants and almsmen, guarding and maintaining that which they had come to despoil. It seemed only just. My climb brought me to a craggy outcrop, and a glimmer of white caught my eye. I clambered over to it, trying to suspend my hopes. It proved to be nothing more than a bit of quartz caught in the moonlight. I'd spent much of the last year crawling all over the face of Mount Garcus. Little wonder if my discouragement began to outweigh my need for solace. My fear that she'd been taken away, as had Alec, was looking more and more likely now, and if I wanted her back, perhaps another pact was called for. The question was, what might be demanded of me in sacrifice? I'd lost everything already. What I had received in return, well, there was little point to any of it without Tatiana. Far back in my mind was the thought that if I was able to put her to a final rest, I would join her, to be her husband in death, as I'd not been able to be in life. Splitting my heart with a staff of wood, cutting off my head, stranding myself in the sunny dawn, something could be arranged with or without help. Death was not beyond me if I chose to reach for it. This night's search was coming to an end, though. I could scent the change in the air. Turning, I scrambled up the rock as easily as another man might walk over level ground. Some 30 yards up, I summoned and gave into a now inherent ability to change my shape. My body began to shrink. Arms closed in, fingers grew long, even my clothes melded to my flesh, turning into the softest of black fur. It was painless and freeing, and once the process was finished, I launched into the open air, catching the sky with my wings. I spiraled up and up, first the cliff swinging into view, then the valley. Stars glowed hot above, cool darkness reigned below, and I soared carelessly in between, master of the air. The overlook came level now, but I avoided it and sped toward the front of the keep. I'd made a small opening in an inconspicuous place above the doors and squeezed through into the front entry. Keeping this form, I flew swiftly through the rooms to the hall stairs and spiraled down again. Near the bottom, I located another minute chink in the masonry and pushed my way in. It was a long crawl for a creature of my size, 12 feet or more. I emerged into a vast chamber that housed the crypts of those who had lived here before me. Despite these quiet neighbors, this place was not silent. The heavy air was filled with the sound and motion of other bats who had long ago established a sanctuary in this spot. The bats were gregarious. I was not. Though I didn't mind their company, nor they mine. I hovered in place and, with a sudden surge of inner strength, resumed the shape of a man again. As might be expected of one who spends a portion of his time in death's embrace, I had a coffin. Any bed would have served, I suppose, but since it was already placed here and ready, it seemed a shame not to put it to use. It was excellent protection against intruders, human or otherwise. Though the chances were slight of anyone finding his or her way down here, I knew most people aren't overly anxious to open up a coffin. The box itself was a brilliant example of the coffin-maker's art, all smooth black wood and brass fittings. The sun was coming. There were some stained glass windows facing east in another part of the crypt, so distant as to make the penetration of true light into this section impossible. Yet another good reason to have a solid bit of wood between me and destruction. I raised the lid, stepped in, and lay flat, lowering it as one pulls up a comforting blanket against the chill. Silence. Then, oblivion. The sun was up. Sixth moon, 398. I've left it too long, I thought. The bastard will be dead by now. I meant the epithet in its every sense, for all its meanings applied to Leo de Lisnia. Nearly 50 years had passed since that night of death, when he'd made his attempt to seize the rule of Barovia. Those men he'd left behind in his haste to escape had paid heavily for their crimes, but it was past time that their master faced justice, if he still lived. Now that I'd been moved to take action, I had little tolerance for further waiting, but found myself forced to do so. Anyway, I paced up and down in the antechamber. I've left it too long. Where have the years gone? For gone they were, never to be retrieved. Busy with dozens of fascinating projects, I'd forgotten about time's effects on others. So it was that when I finally took it upon myself to visit the head of the Wachter family, I was unprepared to find Lovina Wachter not the fragile-looking child I'd last seen, but a solid, energetic woman in her middle 50s. She extended her hand. "Welcome, Lord Vasily." I briefly touched the tips of her fingers with my own and bowed. "You do me much honor, lady." After inquiries to whether I needed any refreshment, which I graciously declined, she asked me to be seated. We were all in the receiving hall of the Wachter home, and it had changed very little from those days when her father had been my host. She settled herself. "Now, sir, may I ask why you have requested to see me?" "I am here as an envoy for Strahd Von Zarovich," I said, without the usual formal preamble. I could almost see her adding up sums in her head and working out that Lord Strahd was in his 90s. 92, to be exact. I drew out an oilcloth packet from my coat and opened it. "Here is a letter you wrote him, and a letter of introduction for myself, which he was generous enough to pen in his own hand." She took both sheets of parchment and read the introduction right through. As the head of an important house, she would know my writing well enough by now from past documents. This one told her that I was Lord Vasily von Holtz, and that she was to consider my voice the voice of Strahd in all matters, and render me every reasonable assistance for my errand. "I have heard the von Holtz name, but I am not familiar with it," she said. "We are an old house, and though loyal to Lord Strahd, have not been as visible in our service to him as have others. However, the honor has fallen to me to make up for it. Lord Strahd was very interested in your news." She looked over her own letter as if to refresh her mind. It was tantalizingly brief, stating only that she was certain she'd located Leo and asked if Strahd was as anxious as she to bring the man to justice. She was prepared to cooperate with him to that end. "What exactly is your errand, sir?" "I am charged with finding and executing Leo de Lisnia. Here," I handed her another sheet of parchment, "is his death warrant signed by my Lord Strahd." This inspired another study. "You will kill him, if you but direct me to him." She apparently decided I was more than capable of performing the task. "Do you know why he is condemned?" I am acquainted with the facts. It has been many years, but Strahd has never given up his hope of finding and dealing with the traitor." This was true, though if I had not let myself get distracted, it wouldn't have gone on for so long. To be fair, in all that time, the trail had grown quite cold. Barovia was not that large a place, but somehow Leo had managed to bury himself very thoroughly. It was logical to conclude he'd readied a sanctuary in case his coup failed. The only thing I was certain of was that he hadn't escaped the country. Since the night of his betrayal, the borders of Barovia had been, for all purposes, closed by a magical, uncrossable mist. Lavina set the parchments to one side. "Lord Vasily, before you were born, my mother, sister, and brothers were butchered by Leo de Lisnia. My aunts and uncles—" She broke off to put a hand to her mouth, then turned it into a fist and forced it away again. "You want him punished?" She licked her lips and nodded. "Can you promise me that?" "My voice is the voice of Strahd," I said truthfully. "If Leo still lives, he shall receive all that he deserves." "And more?" I smiled. "Yes, lady." Lavina took me to her study and, on a beautifully painted map of the country, pointed to a spot on the flanks of Mount Baratok. She indicated a rectangle representing a building of considerable size perched high on its northwestern spur, right at the border. My spirits sank. "A monastery? You're certain?" From my point of view, Leo could not have picked a worse place for me to find him. I saw him. This month, I was invited as a guest to their Festival of the White Sun. I was introduced to some of the residents who lived there. He was one of them, going by the name of Henrik Steinman. And You recognized him after all these years? She'd expected some doubt. Yes, I was but a child then, but I remember Leo standing over us. I fastened my eyes on a gold chain he was wearing. Hanging from it was a pendant in the shape of a roaring lion. Steinman was wearing that pendant. Oh, there cannot be another like it. If that is so, why keep something so identifiable? And why would he wear it if he knew you would be there? I couldn't say. Perhaps he'd forgotten, or he may have thought I was too young to remember. Or it may be the wrong man. I know the old man I saw was Leo. And I was hoping she was mistaken. A monastery. Oh, even the thought of going near one made my belly churn. Leo had most certainly realized the exact nature of my change that night. What better place of protection could he find from a creature like me than a house of holiness? For the sake of appearance, I had traveled to the Wachter lands by coach, resting in the safety of its dark interior by day and cantering along on one of the horses by night. It was a great black conveyance, bearing my coat of arms on the doors. Lovina offered me hospitality readily enough, but I turned it down in favor of an immediate start on the last portion of my journey. My horses were still fresh, not having been driven far that night. It was a relief to mount up and be off. The coach rattling behind, empty, but for a long light-proof box, I guided the horses toward the monastery. Lovina had given me careful directions, readily answering all my questions. My final query, though, startled her somewhat.
Have you a crypt or a place of burial here?
Yes, she said, her wonderment plain. We have a cemetery just south of the main house.
With a mausoleum?
Yes.
And does it have room for additional occupants?
She nodded.
Excellent.
I managed to avoid explaining myself on that one and left soon after. The road made a steady climb and leveled. Traffic was not unknown here, but for anyone to be using it after dark was highly unusual. I supposed if I went knocking on one of the doors and asked for lodging, it might even be given. This was a corner of the country I'd not been in for a very long time, after all. But I was not planning to seek out sustenance just yet. In fact, when I arrived at the monastery, I wanted to be hungry. Within an hour, I was approaching the monastery, a vast building perched on a steep tier of rock. Guiding the horses into a stand of pines, I dismounted and listened to the woods around us. Almost immediately, the wolves began to howl. They knew me. All the wolves of Barovia did. The call of their many voices was too much for me to ignore. Before another minute passed, I had joyfully assumed their form and thrown back my head to join the chorus. My four-legged brothers heard me and rushed from their places in the shadows to give greetings. I instructed them to guard the coach until my return. Now it, the horses, and, most important, my box were as safe as could be expected under the circumstances. I wasted no time in taking on the shape of a bat. Wings lifting me above the trees, I flew as fast as I could toward the sheer walls of the monastery. Crouched in a deep shadow, in the angle of a staircase, I tried to make myself small. For a man of my height, this was no easy task. Little wonder I caught the attention of a lone monk as he padded down the stairs. He glanced into the patch of darkness and stopped cold to stare. I gave him no chance to do anything else, swinging him around and locking my eyes on his. Despite the depth of the shadows, I was able to quickly subdue his will to mine.
Henrik Steinman. Where is he?
I snarled. The young fellow's pupils were but pinpoints. Looking blind, he pointed without hesitation up the stairs he'd used.
Take me to him, quickly.
I released my grip on his shoulder, and he complied with gratifying speed. The little man trotted down a lengthy walkway on the north wall of the building. The monk made a turn toward the keep and went down a flight of stairs. The buildings here had many windows and doors, an indication that they were used as habitations. Each door looked exactly like its neighbor, and only by means of the names painted on them could one determine the tenant. Without help, I might have wandered here all night looking for Steinman. The monk came to a halt before a door bearing that name.
Stand to one side and do not move, I told him.
He obeyed. It never occurred to me to knock. I simply let myself relax and the burden of a solid body was no longer mine. I floated upon the wind like a wisp of smoke, a spin, and die. And I was pouring under the door, flowing silently into Steinman's room like creeping death. Resuming shape, I caught the barest glimpse of a windowless chamber before staggering into something that seared my skin and tore into my lungs like acid. Every corner, from floor to ceiling, was filled with half-visible tracings that grew brighter as they pulled at me. Holy symbols covered the walls. They'd been placed there by true believers, weaving a grasping net like a spider's web, and I blundered into it. The onslaught of the latent magic in this chamber was too much. I fell to my knees, right into the fiery white center of a holy sign painted on the wood floor. It was like sinking into burning quicksand. The more I struggled, the harder it dragged on me. I was flat on my back, helpless, unable to fight by gesture or word. And as I lay there, straining against invisible bonds, Leo Delisnia came to stand over me. He was not the old man Rowena described, but the young one I remembered, with only 10 more years imprinted on his face. Was this Leo's son? He stared for a long moment, then said, "Hail, Strahd, Lord of Barovia." I knew for certain then. Despite appearances, this was Leo Delisnia. "I've waited ages for you to come," he continued. "It took Rowena long enough to get you here. Could she have been his..." No. Impossible. His dupe, perhaps. That was more likely. He walked over to one corner and lifted up a long pole that I first took to be a walking staff. It was carved with words of power that glowed. They writhed all down its length, moving as he moved. One end came to a very sharp point. "How waited for me to come?" I asked, hoping he would explain himself. "There's a difference between waiting and expecting, Strahd. I've had years to prepare for you. I put it to good use studying the art. I supposed you pictured yourself just smothering me like a candle. What had you to fear from one old man, you thought? All you expected to worry about was getting into this place." My eyes fixed hard on the ceiling as I tried to concentrate.